Hi, grade 7s. Today we're going to be looking at the language section of the practice paper that you've been going through. Again, I don't want you to worry too much about crosses and ticks and being accurate with marking. The point of doing this is to learn, to revise certain concepts. So I'd like you to be making sure that with a pencil or some colored pens that you're writing additional notes on, around, next to your answers, and that you're doing corrections, elaborating, improving on, and editing. Now, the questions themselves are on page 126, and I hope you've had a chance to give them a go. If not, I'd like you to press pause and to make sure you answer the questions first. You can either look in your textbook or you can look at the slide. I've got 1, 2, 3 up there for you. You can pause and have a look, and then they continue 4, 5, 6, and then today we're going to go up to question 7. All right, so let's start with number 1. They want you to use the first sentence from the text and explain why it's a complete sentence by identifying parts of speech and punctuation marks. So the very first sentence was that very first sentence of paragraph 1 where it says, when we set out, there was not a cloud in the sky. So that's part of the question. They want you to, first of all, find it and then explain why it is a complete sentence. Okay, so make sure that you get it from the text, and they want you to explain why a complete sentence is a full sentence. So remember, a sentence must start with a capital letter. It includes a subject doing an action. It must end with suitable punctuation, and it must make complete sense on its own. They want you to identify, to name, okay, or to show. They want you to name the parts of the sentence that show that it's full. So you can name the different parts by labeling them or by listing them in a paragraph, or when in doubt, you can be thorough and do both. So first you need to write out the sentence to show that you know which one it is, and then you can work. It's preferable to put quotation marks so that you can show that that part comes from the text. Then you need to start off with a nice sentence to explain. The most important thing is this is a complete sentence because it makes complete sense. It's not a phrase or a part of a sentence, it's a complete, full sense. Next, it has a subject. Can you see we is the subject in that sentence? And it has the verb we set. And also the sentence begins with a capital letter and it ends with punctuation, in this case an exclamation mark. So it's for 4 marks. So you can give yourself a tick if you've said that it makes complete sense or it doesn't need anything else to complete its sense. You can give yourself another mark for mentioning either that it has a subject, you can name the subject if you like, for stating that there's a verb, and anything to do with punctuation. So as long as you've learnt, and you should know what makes a sentence complete or full. Those are the things that you should be checking every time you write a sentence. Good. Question 2. Are questions, statements, commands, or exclamations used mostly in this passage? Explain why this suits the purpose of the text. That's for 2 marks. Now, first of all, questions, statements, commands, or exclamations are used mostly. So obviously they've used some of each of those, but they want to know which one is predominant. Okay. Which one is used most in this passage? So just to remind you again about the 4 main types of sentences, a question is usually a request for information. They want to elicit something from you. So it often includes a question word such as who, what, when, where, which. There's a whole bunch of them. And it's shown or marked by using a question mark. A statement is when you declare or state an idea. So using a sentence. So usually a statement is just marked by a full stop. We have a command. A command is an order or a directive. So it will be telling or compelling you to do something. A command often has a full stop, but if you want to say it with force, then you can use an exclamation mark. Now, an exclamation is usually a sudden cry or remark, and it expresses a strong emotion, surprise, or pain. You guys are pretty good at recognizing an exclamation. At the end of an exclamation sentence, you'll put 1 exclamation mark to mark it as such. Okay, now they want to know, in this whole passage, Beckoned by a Beautiful Beast, what is used most? Now, they've mostly used statements. Okay. Most stories use mostly statements. Only occasionally do we ask a question or give a command or an exclamation, which is why it's important also in writing not to use too many exclamation marks. So here's an example of what you could say. You could word it by saying the passage or the text uses mostly, which one was it? Statements. Or you could have said something like most of the sentences in the text are statements. You could elaborate further and say there are a few questions, but mostly statements. Good. So you're going to get 1 mark for identifying which type is used mostly. Now the question continues. They want you to explain why this suits the purpose. So don't get too stuck. They just want to know how this suits the purpose of the text. There's a few things you could say. You could say it is because it's a factual account. And when we're stating facts, we usually use statements. You could have said it's suitable because the language used is not very emotional or emotive. If it was, perhaps there would have been more exclamations. It suits the style of this personal account, which explains what happened. You can get a sense from this passage that the person's not being too dramatic. They're pretty much stating what happened in a fairly matter of fact. Although what happened was dramatic, his style is not very dramatic. So you can get 2 marks for mentioning anything along those lines. All right, good. Number 3, they want you to write an antonym for these words using a different prefix for each. So they want you to write a word that means the opposite. You're going to do that by adding a prefix to the front of the word. So try not to use the same prefix for each word. So remember, an antonym is a word that has an opposite. We often make antonyms by adding a prefix to the front of a word. So a prefix could be a word, a letter, or a number, and it's affixed to the front. Okay. So it's affixed to the front of what we call a root or a stem word. So 3.1 was experienced. If we add the prefix in, we'll get the word inexperienced. Suitable, if we add the prefix un, we'll get unsuitable. Organized, if we affix the prefix dis, we get disorganized. And prepared, if we affix the prefix un to the front, we get unprepared. Those are the most commonly used ones, but you could have also said unexperienced, that's also a word. And you could have said unorganized. And prepared, you could have also said underprepared. Right. Can you see that sometimes the prefix is just a few letters and other times it's a whole word, such as underprepared? Right. So you can give yourself a mark for mentioning any of those words. Good. Number 4. They ask you to write out both adjectives of comparison for these words. So they want you to write 2 other adjectives for each one given. Remember, adjectives of comparison compare 2 nouns. So remember, there are 3 degrees of comparison. There's the positive, comparative, and the superlative. Remember, when you were in younger grades, you learned big, bigger, biggest, right? So big would be the positive, bigger, the comparative degree of comparison, and biggest, the superlative. All right, good. So fast would be our positive degree of comparison. The comparative degree comparing the 2 nouns would be faster, and the superlative fastest. They have to be spelled correctly. All right, so please just double check your spelling with your eyes. So at 4.2, confident would be our positive degree. Now we need a comparative degree. Okay, in this case, we're going to use more and most. So the comparative is more confident, and the superlative, most confident. All right. Sorry, I wrote most confident twice. That should say superlative. In this case, they haven't asked you to identify or name them. So even if you haven't written positive, comparative, superlative, you can still get the mark, as long as you've written, for example, fast, faster, fastest, and it's spelled correctly. So it's actually half a mark for saying faster and half a mark for saying fastest. Half a mark for saying more confident and half a mark for saying most confident. If you said confidenter or confidentist, then unfortunately you did not get the mark. Right. Number 5, they want you to invent a collective noun for hikers and rescuers. Now this is quite an unusual way to ask the question. A collective noun, remember, it's a kind of noun, a type of noun. You know that a noun is a naming word. So a collective noun is a name given to a group. So for example, you know a group of cows is called a herd. They don't want you to search for a collective noun in the text or in a book. They want you to invent your own collective noun to describe a group of hikers. Quite a weird way of asking the question. And a group of rescuers. So you can use any collective noun that you think is suitable. It should be a little bit descriptive, or it should sound like it belongs. So something that you think would describe that particular group. They're actually just testing to see if you know what a collective noun is. So it's best if you write it in a little phrase as opposed to just one word. So for example, you could say hikers, or a collective noun for hikers could be a group of hikers. You could have said something like a trail of hikers or a tour of hikers. See, that gives you, the collective noun gives you an idea of what the group is about, what they do. All right, rescuers, you may have heard of people speaking about a party of rescuers, that's fine. A team of rescuers, anything along those lines, you can give yourself a mark for writing that. If you've just written, for example, group, I want you to go and I want you to write it as a little phrase, a group of hikers. All right. All right, number 6, the narrator uses figurative language in the story. And then there's a few questions that follow. Now, the first part is not a question, it's a statement for you to reflect on to give you more of an idea of what's to follow. So let's just check if we know these terms. The narrator is the person telling the story. And we know that the person telling the story uses figurative language or figures of speech. Okay. So 6.1 says identify the figure of speech used in the title. So they want you to name the figure of speech used in the title. Now remember the title of the story? The title of the story is the name of the story. It was beckoned by a beautiful beast. So in grade 7, you expected to be able to recognize these figures of speech in the text. So if you don't know any of these, now would be a good time to start reviewing the ones that you are unsure of. You need to know a simile, metaphor, personification, a pun, and hyperbole we looked at briefly last year, as well as the sound devices that you know, alliteration, assonance you know, and onomatopoeia. So they could have used any of those in the title. In fact, I've just spotted one that I didn't see before, and that is alliteration. So if you spotted alliteration and you mentioned that they repeated the letter B, beckoned by a beautiful beast, you can give yourself a mark straight away. All right. I saw the figure of speech used in the title is a metaphor, and I hope that most of you picked up on this because we mentioned it right at the beginning of the text. All right. So if you did, good job. You could have also worded it differently. You could have said the narrator is comparing the Drakensberg Mountains to a beast, or elaborated on it in any way. So as long as you mentioned either a metaphor or alliteration, then you can give yourself a mark for that. Good. Following on from that question, what atmosphere does this create for the telling of the story? So the atmosphere, they want to know the mood or the tone that metaphor that we just mentioned in the title creates. All right. So you could have said something along the lines of the use of the word beast in the title. See how it's referring to the question above. Gives us you could have said an ominous feeling, that means almost a spooky feeling, or a sense of foreboding that something bad is about to happen. You could have said, you could have mentioned more specifically the use of the metaphor, comparing the mountain with a beast. Maybe gives us a feeling that there's something dangerous or beastly about the mountain. Or that gives us a clue that something dangerous is going to happen. Because usually a beast is not something that's soft and cuddly, but rather something that's dangerous. So you obviously don't need to word it exactly the same way as me. As long as you've mentioned something about a beast and how that might give you a feeling that something bad is about to happen, you can give yourself a mark for that. All right, 6.3. What figure of speech is used repeatedly in the story to describe the weather? All right, so you're looking for another figure of speech. We've just listed them, so you should have them ready. All right, and we're looking for another figure of speech that occurs a few times. And they want you to look at something that's being used to describe the weather. They ask you to give examples. Okay, so if you were unsure how to word it, put the question in the answer. The figure of speech that is repeated throughout the text to describe the weather is, can you see how I use the same phrasing? Okay, I see personification. Okay, so just a reminder, personification is when we give human characteristics to something non-human. So there were a few. I spotted howling blizzard, the storm hit us, and the clouds gathering. So if you found any of those, perhaps you found some others, you can give yourself a mark for having found identified personification, and another mark if you found any phrase or sentence where the weather itself. So they're not looking for other forms of personification. They're referring specifically to the weather. I had a few people who found alliteration when they said suitable sleeping bags and a few other words. Unfortunately, that's not going to be correct because they're looking for specifically for figures of speech that describe the weather and not other things. All right, good. So if you've quoted something that describes the weather, then you can give yourself another mark. All right, 6.4. What images and impressions does this create for the telling of the story? All right, that's 1 mark. Okay, here's an example. If you're not sure how to word the answer, you could have said it gives the impression that the weather was. And I thought that all that personification gave us the impression that the weather was acting against them. You could have said maybe trying to hurt them or to harm them, almost like an enemy. So you'll use your own wording. Obviously, you won't say exactly the same thing, but you might say something like it felt like they were in a battle against the elements, or that the weather was working against them, or trying to make things difficult for them. All right. So you can give yourself a mark for if you manage to express that it seems like the weather was trying to do some harm or trying to sabotage their efforts. Good. 6.5. They want you to write an expression to summarize the main idea of the story or a moral or a lesson in the story. So a few people were confused with the word expression. Okay, an expression could mean a facial expression, like a grimace or a frown, but in this case, an expression in English grammar is a phrase. It's a group of words that we use when we speak. It's colloquial. So for example, an idiom would be an expression. It's something traditional that we say when we speak. So for example, if someone was saying, instead of saying someone's not at home, we might say she's out. So can you see it's just a common phrasing that we use. Okay, so they want you to think of your own kind of expression or idiom or little phrase that could describe what happened, something that happened in the story. So here's an example. You could have said something like, they survived against the odds. So can you see it's almost like a cliche. You could have said they pushed through, they made it, right? So if you have another expression, remember an expression is a common phrase, it's colloquial, it's something that we use when we speak. It might not be understood by someone of a different language, or it's something that we traditionally use like an idiom. So if you've mentioned an idiom and it has to do with the story, then you can give yourself a mark, even if it's not one of these. All right, we're very, very near the end, so let's just keep pushing through. All right, number 7. Is the story in the past, present, or future tense? And they want you to explain why. So they want to know what tense the narrator is using to tell the story. Just a clue, most stories are written in the past tense. So if you want to check, then you can look at the verbs in the passage and use them to identify the tense. So in this case, it was very clear the whole story was written in the same tense. Be careful because sometimes authors do switch tenses, but when you are writing, it's always best to stick to one tense. So this story is told in the past tense because it's about an event that happened in the past. We can see that it's written in the past tense because the verbs are in their past tense form. So there's many examples. They say, when we were, it was. Right, so you could have given any example of verb in its past tense form. They're going to give you a mark not for saying past tense, but for saying past tense and then giving an explanation. So you could have said something like, because usually stories are told in the past tense because it's about something that happened in the past or something that happened previously. Or if you mentioned the fact that the verbs were in their past tense form. All right, so if you've got up to this point, okay, then I'm very, very happy. Good.